When we're ready, we're going to start with a pule from Pilipo. So Pilipo has volunteered to do this for us. So,
aloha. Thank you very much for this opportunity to come here and listen to what Mr. Fritzl Al has for us to digest here. I just want to say that the people of Waianae area, the coast of Waianae, have been always the stalwarts on what has been going on for a number of years in their opposition. And I'd just like to just give thanks to the Lord. Pulikako, let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord. We thank you, Lord, for all of your blessings, Lord. We thank you, Lord, especially for this place we call our home, our Aina. Ko Hawaii Pai Aina, the archipelago of the Hawaiian kingdom. Lord, we come before you, Lord, as our brother Al Fritzl will share an interesting concept, Lord, of what is known as downsizing. We have been an occupied country for 121 years, Lord. And it started with 160 so-called blue jackets, Marines that landed and were deployed with combat-ready equipment with them. And that has never gone away, Lord. We ask that you guide Brother Al as he presents what he has to present to the people. And let the people open their hearts and open their minds, Lord. And not to be so eager to cast negative remarks, but to be ready. Because one day, Lord, you know that this will come to be. And if it starts just with the Army, let it be in your desire, Lord. Bless everyone that's here. Open our minds and our hearts. This we ask in our Lord, Yesu Christo, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Kehikino. Aloha mai kako, I'm Manu Ka'iyama, and it really is a pleasure to be here back on the Waianae coast. I want to say mahalo to all of you for making me feel welcomed and the aloha you've expressed to myself and my husband. It is like coming home for me. My great-great-grandfather was William Helenihi, and he lived on Makua. And in Ili there, he and his brother ran the train from Makua to Wahiawa and back and forth. I have much of my ohana was born out here. Once they were kicked out of Makua, we transplanted into Makaha and Waianae and then Palama, and the rest is history. But it's always like coming home here, so I really want to say mahalo nui for your aloha. Let's see. The purpose of this event is to learn more about the Quadrennial Defense Review of 2014 that states without a doubt there will be reduction in its forces. So this means the regular Army, the Army National Guard, and the U.S. Army Reserve. Hawaii locations have been nominated for personnel cuts, and they include Schofield by 16,000 and Fort Shafter by 3,800 personnel. This is a community informational presentation being hosted by the OCAD, that stands for Oahu Council for Army Downsizing, and it's led by Colonel Retired Al Frenz. So before we get started, in case you don't know, the lua is on that side. The lumi ho'opau pirikia, the bathrooms, are over there on that side. So. And also, we're estimating to go a little bit after 9 o'clock. Because this is an informational presentation, we won't be doing questions from the audience, but at any time, if you have a question, write it out, please. Seek me out I'll be sitting right over there, and you can slide it to me by passing it down. And if we have time at the end of the show, then I'll be going through the questions, and hopefully we'll be answering them. What this group has attempted to do is to come up with some FAQs, some facts to discuss that we think or assume will be on your mind. So hopefully we'll take care of some of those questions through that process. So first we'll begin with Al, who's going to be doing about a 25-minute presentation on what this is all about. And then we'll follow up with some of those facts, and then we'll also have an opportunity for questions if we have time. Hikinosa, I want to introduce him. Many of you know him already, but he's been a resident of the Leeward community for 12 years. He's been a part of beautiful Hawaii for 40 years. He was a career logistician. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, logistician, for the Army, and in his last assignment on faculty of the Army War College, he was lesson author and exercise director for his department's curriculum issue on force structuring of the Armed Forces of the United States. Okay, he has also published on the importance of restructuring the armed forces. Colonel Retired Al Frenzel has a unique background on the timely issue of Army downsizing, and he sees his experience at Mana'o on this issue to be vitally important to the future of Hawaii. And he also sees this cause as a special calling for him in which he must speak up and serve Hawaii on this critical issue, especially since he has the background to do so. So if we could welcome Al. Mahalo.
Aloha mai kako. Thank you for this time. I'm going to run through some of the overview real quick so we can get to the questions. As the first slide shows, I do want to make a point. In my estimation, this is a once-in-a-century opportunity for Hawaii Nei. There will never be another round of cuts like this of the Army, nevertheless even the military, in my lifetime, and more likely possibly your Keiki's lifetime. This is a busy slide. I'm only going to talk to it for 30 seconds, so don't worry. The key purpose of this slide is to tell you there is an involved process with the Department of Defense and the military services on how they link national defense and national strategy, defense strategy, to actually putting boots on the ground. Boots on the ground being like soldiers and Navy and Marines and airmen on Oahu. Key in this process, the Joint Strategic Planning process, is what's called the Quadrennial Defense Review. And it was recently published early this year and has some specific guidance in it that provides direction to Department of Defense on what their missions are, what their strength levels are, et cetera. And key that came out of that document that we'll talk about briefly is what's called the Special Programmatic Environmental Assessment for the Army Downsizing for 2020. Excuse me, the Army Force Structuring for 2020. If I says Army Downsizing for 2020, that would make you think they aren't starting until 2020, but they have to be done with their downsizing. They're shooting technically by 2019. Okay, so the Quadrennial Defense Review that I mentioned, with a key document of that Joint Strategic Planning System, is a document that's updated every 4 years with guidance from the administration, Congress, intelligence agencies, Department of Defense, a whole collaboration of agencies that developed this document. And to give you some historical background, if you remember the Cold War before the wall fell in Berlin, there was the strategy of Department of Defense, the guidance to the different services was be prepared to fight 2 major theater wars and 1 small-scale contingency. This was their mission, and this is what justified their budgets. It justified what their manning would be. But after the big Russian bear flinched and could no longer afford to keep up with our military spending, eventually they acquiesced, and the Berlin Wall fell down, and the situation worldwide changed. And as a result, the Quadrennial Defense Review required a different change in mission during the post-Cold War period, which was the services be able to conduct 2 nearly simultaneous major theater wars and 1 small-scale contingency. So in essence, a Manini cut in comparison to the next phase, but a small cut from the Cold War to the new post-Cold War era. And there were cuts. You remember, you've heard of peace dividends that were taken after the wall fell. And the military's downsized significantly, and would have done so even more had Gulf Wars I and II and 9/11 got in the way. So that did cause a hiccup in the normal scheme of things of right-sizing the military to the national threats. But the game changer that occurred this year is the new Quadrennial Defense Review mission, which is now only one large-scale multi-phase campaign, and that's just different wording for a major theater war. And then something that, I'll read it to you because it's not termed a small-scale contingency, and here I wrote, 1 ability to deny, hold, or delay a regional aggressor. But the actual language of this ancillary mission is denying the objectives of or imposing unacceptable costs on a second aggressor in another region. I suspect there'll be all kinds of classes at the War College on what that really means. I could interpret that to be, if I'm going to impose unacceptable costs on a regional aggressor, that's everything from a political stance or political announcement on CNN, don't do that, to a nuclear threat. So the range of that is very complicated. So I'd like you to just bear with me and say that the current mission now is 1 major theater war, termed something else, and 1 small-scale contingency, termed something else. Nevertheless, my analysis of this current mission that the services have to perform is 1/3 to really 1/2 of what the mission used to be. And what the implication is on the Army, and I'm just talking the Army for today, is that the current strength of about 570,000, that's what's in the environmental assessment that was released in June, and really I think the Army is already at 550,000 right now, but they've been mandated to go as low as 440 to 450,000 service members. There's also cuts recommended for the National Guard and the Army Reserve, but they're fairly small. You have to imagine where the Army saves money is in their active duty forces. And I'll also say that this document and this requirement to downsize drives the budget. And because it drives the budget, those budgets have already been adjusted for those out years. That money is not in the services budget. So the Army has to meet the requirements of this document, of this strategy, or it has to pay for its costs out of hide. And what that does is cause what we call a hollow service, where it may have the forces, but it has no combat power. Hollow forces are not condoned by the Congress, the administration, or even the services for that matter. So they would only get away with that for a very short time. So in essence, this document will drive the budget that will drive the forces down to as low as 450,000. Except sequestration is still a legal factor in our United States laws. Sequestration has been delayed for 2 years till FY16. If sequestration kicks in again, if it's not either canceled, which is very unlikely, or delayed, which is medium likely, the services are required to downsize, the Army is required to downsize to 420,000. That's a pretty huge cut. That's 130,000 from roughly today's size forces. So what happened in June 27th is the Army published a document called the Special Programmatic Environmental Assessment for Force Structuring of the Army for 2020. And I almost ignored it because I just assumed it was re-announcing cuts you all heard about over a year ago about the Schofield maybe losing one brigade, 8,000 soldiers, which means basically one brigade. We heard that. Some of us may have attended the meeting at Fort Shafter when they announced that, and that's pretty, it's significant, but it's not a game changer. But when I read the document and saw that the QDR requirements required the Army to look at all of its installations and decide where to or identify where those cuts would be, it was, then we all found out that Fort Shafter is on the hook to lose 3,800 soldiers and civilians, and Schofield Barracks is on the hook to lose 16,000. These two figures of 19,800 is a game changer, and that made me wake up while I'm reading behind the computer and say, this figure, if approved, changes the whole landscape of Central Oahu, because if that quantity of forces was approved as the Army would like to see, they cannot justify retaining Schofield Barracks, Wheeler Army Airfield, Makua Valley, Dillingham Airfield, and some other installations. But for purposes of my position as the director for the Oahu Council for Army Downsizing is I'm recommending that some installations be left off the table for later discussion, because primarily some of the other installations, whether it be Kahuku or East Range or PTA on the Big Island, the Hawaii Army National Guard needs to come online and speak to whether they need those facilities for training. So we can't take everything away from who would be remaining behind, which would be the Hawaii Army National Guard. I could make an argument that the Hawaii Army National Guard is not needed here in the same configuration that they are now, or the 442nd Regiment, and then I'd have all kinds of people attacking me. But the facts are, Hawaii would be much better off if it had other civil affairs type units, engineer type units, non-combat type units that could not only do engagement throughout the Pacific of helping communities and building, doing construction and mitigating natural disasters, but they could also do that for the state of Hawaii and help us with those incidents as well. Though engineer forces and civil affairs forces and things like, and special operations forces are much more valuable to the needs of Hawaii and the Pacific Theater. But that's for a whole different discussion, oh by the way. So nevertheless, Oahu is identified on this list of 19 states, 30 bases, I think it counts up to lose soldiers. And here's the quantity here. Now, the Army picked more locations than it needs to achieve the 130,000 cut. And they did that because they know they will run into resistance. They will run into political resistance. The Army will not decide where these cuts occur. The Army will make recommendations. The Army did the EA in order to acquire opinions on their analysis of the situation and acquire information from the different installations affected. The Army will come out and do sensing sessions with the installations affected. It will put into its magic recommendation machine all the feedback that they get and all of the analysis that they do, both economic and strategic, et cetera, of why of what their recommendations would be for cuts. And when they make those, and when they go through that process, they will make those recommendations to the Congress. They will do it in open sessions, they will do it in closed sessions, but the Congress is going to weigh in, and they'll be doing the arm wrestling and telling the Department of Defense and the United States Army where it can do its cuts. Okay, but nevertheless, here's the list of those units that have been identified, those bases. Some of them will not be cut. I'll guarantee it. 2 years ago, if we were here now and Senator Inouye was alive, Hawaii would not be cut. But this is a game changer. We don't have the same congressional clout that we used to have. So we are as vulnerable, and even more so, now that we don't have the second biggest industry of Hawaii still alive with us. But if you look at some of these bases, and I'll let you do that on your own time, and this is available on the www.oc4ad website, but some of these bases are untouchable for strategic reasons, untouchable for their congressional power, untouchable for the geographic locations and constituents that reside nearby. I don't believe any longer that Hawaii and both Schofield and U.S. Army Garrison Hawaii at Fort Shafter are untouchable anymore. So because of that, and because of this game changer of the number that was identified, as part of the council, I am suggesting, and the council, the few members that we have at this time, and we're growing, believe that the Army, as I mentioned earlier, cannot justify retaining these bases any longer. And these bases in particular, Schofield Barracks and Wheeler Army Airfield, Makua Valley, Dillingham, and we would acquire Kolikoli Pass with Schofield Barracks, but we need to demand unimpeded access through Lualula for a variety of reasons, and most of which is that is a readily available emergency access road, but I prescribe that it shouldn't be for just emergency access road. You and I should be allowed to be on that road and drive on that road anytime we want, including tourists. And especially if we have Hawaii's people living in Schofield Barracks, and it's a great means to travel to businesses that would be in schools and colleges and other facilities that would be on that right over the pass. Some of the advantages, and this may be hard to read, but there are, in my opinion, about $100 billion worth of assets between Schofield Barracks and Wheeler Army Airfield. Whether it's the facilities, whether it's the family housing, whether it's the airfield, the hangars, the schools, the fire stations, the office buildings, the barrack space, and ad infinitum. Basically, two cities, one big city, one small city, ready to be occupied and fully serviced and maintained. These are beautiful, pristine bases. They are not Barber's Point that was allowed to deteriorate for 15 years before the state of Hawaii acquired it. These are pristine facilities, that much of which, over the last 20 years, has either been built brand new or totally renovated. So you can peruse that list, but I also brought this particular map here, and I'll talk to it for a second. So this is an aerial shot of Schofield Barracks. Okay, so if you haven't been there recently or you haven't been there at all, you can actually go on to oc4ad.com. There's a high-def resolution there. You can zero in on these areas and look at it even closer detail than this map. But Schofield Barracks, here's H2 coming in here. Okay, H2 lets off here. Wilson Lake is right up here. Kunia Road is this one. Kunia Road is this one. Okay. This is Cam Highway, just to try to get you oriented before I start talking about this. So we got H2 coming in here, Cam Highway going through Waihiwa. Here's a bridge over Wilson Lake right here. Okay. So in this the left side over here is a majority of the fixed installation infrastructure of Schofield Barracks. Not shown is the huge firing ranges and training areas over here. And then if I had Kolikoli Pass, Kolikoli Pass would be down here somewhere. And if I had Ammunition Road down to Lualula, we'd be way down there. But for the key of this is, everything marked in red, whether it be this big huge area here, this area, this area, this area, this area, this area, this area, all family housing. Okay, 38,000 soldiers and family members reside on this family housing. In this area right here, this used to be Kalakala Golf Course, about 70-acre golf course. And housing was, because the Army was paying so much to pay for its soldiers to be on the economy, This entire golf course in the 90s and early 2000s was turned into housing, brand new single-family housing, some duplexes, but most of it's single-family. So just in the housing alone, imagine the impact that would be to beneficiaries on the DHHL waiting list, to contributing to low-income housing, and in regards to the quads, where our single soldiers reside, particularly here and then a couple throughout, 7,000 single-family soldiers reside in very nice renovated rooms with either private baths or shared baths with one other room. Imagine our homeless families being able to occupy and go through rehab and retraining and a program to get them back on the road to recovery. Similar to what occurs with U.S. vets at Barbers Point right now, but on a much bigger scale. So on the right side is Wheeler Army Airfield. And so it has its housing areas, and this is all brand new as well. And an airfield for small aircraft operations. Could be a private airfield, could be, you name it. And imagine all of the hangars, or some of the hangars being diverted for use by the Hawaii film industry. And of course, many of you know the Hawaii film industry does a lot of their filming in this area and up in this area, both with, rain, especially many of your combat films are filmed there. And imagine if they had sound stages in these hangars. These are just some ideas. I'm not associated with the film industry whatsoever, or any of these industries, but just imagine what possibilities exist out there for facilities of such quality and magnitude. And we can go more into that later on in the FAQs. So here's what's key, is the timeline. You can either read it here, or I'm going to go left to right. So on 27 June, the Army released the supplemental programmatic environmental assessment for the force structure change for 2020. And in that's when it announced that the Army is considering these particular cuts, and it was a very somewhat involved EA, and it talked about different various categories of that were evaluated in how the different installations would be affected if the downsizing occurred in their backyard. And across the board in all 19 states, there was only one area that was partially significant. Okay, first of all, this document found it to be a FONSI, finding a no significant impact. Okay, that's pretty substantial. That means that the EA is essentially approved pending results from the communities, but no significant impact if any of these bases closed. The only thing that was even close to an impact was, in all cases and equally, social economic impacts. As you can imagine, this is an impact on the Waihiwa community and other communities. There's no way to avoid that. There is a impact, but we'll talk about that as well. But that impact that Waihiwa faces is the same impact that they face in New York, and they face in Seattle, Tacoma, in any of the adjacent towns and villages that support or are co-located with military bases across the 19 states. So there was a comment period that expired on 25 August. How many submitted feedback? Hey, all right. We had about, I know of five feedbacks made from Hawaii. And oh, by the way, they're all pro-Army cut. No one that I know of, and I saw none were shared from other communities that were, no, please don't take our soldiers, we need them, they're key to our communities, they're key to the state of Hawaii. I saw none of that. It may have happened, but it didn't happen very significantly. The community was quiet across the board. The press was quiet. The legislators were quiet, and that worked in our favor, at least for those who were in favor of these cuts. It worked in our favor, because the few inputs made by Hawaii for this environmental assessment were, yes, it's long past time, it needs to happen, and here's why. So, and you can read the my council's feedback online. I think it was a pretty good analysis. In fact, I go further than recommending the cuts of 19,800, because that list that I showed you on the environmental assessment for all the bases which have 16,000 marked on them, okay, from Fort Bliss, Fort Bragg, Fort Campbell, Fort Carson, Fort Drum, Fort Hood, Fort Riley, Fort Stewart, Joint Base McChord, and Schofield, 16,000 identified. There was a cap on all those installations, an arbitrary cap, and that's why I argued that, is why are you setting an arbitrary cap that no base can exceed a cut of 16,000? That doesn't make any sense. Because in the case of Schofield Barracks and Wheeler, that leaves 2,441 soldiers remaining behind, and there's no justification for that many soldiers to stay behind. Maybe 2 units out of a quantity about 500. So if you get more specific into the actual units that would be left behind after the maneuver brigades no longer are on Oahu, you can justify pretty much all, if not most, of the 22,500 folks. So nevertheless, that's an example of where the cuts in some installations could theoretically be higher than what the Army recommends. But that period is over, okay? And according to the article in the newspaper on 6 October, the Army has finished reviewing its comments it received. So I told you about the 5 or 6 that I know of, and maybe there's, let's just stretch it and say Waianae submitted some, and let's say we had 50 maybe from Hawaii, but I doubt it, compared to 110,000 comments from the other 18 states. And these 110,000 comments were not, please have the Army leave our base here in Fort Bliss, Texas, or Fort Huachuca, or whatever the base may be. I will bet big money that 99% of them said, don't take them. So here we got a big discrepancy between what Hawaii's responses were and what the other states' responses were. And again, that works in our favor. So, what happens next? That around January or February, actually starting in November through March, the Army will go out to all of these installations and conduct listening sessions. So there hasn't been a schedule published, and I'm not sure exactly, but the way I interpret it is we probably will have 2 listening sessions, one in the Schofield Wheeler Air Force area location, and then somewhere near the Fort Shafter location. Hopefully off base so that we have readily access. But when they did hold this at Fort Shafter 2 years ago to talk about the 8,000 cut, they had procedures for people to get on base without, hassling everybody with their ID card and security procedures. But nevertheless, 2 listening sessions potentially, but maybe only 1, held somewhere on Oahu. They're not going to do like the Department of Interior and go to 14 different locations. This is specific to these bases, and if they do more than 2, I'd really be surprised. Nevertheless, this is the next time people in Hawaii have an opportunity to speak out. And I hope it's something similar to what happened during the Department of the Interior listening sessions or hearings. I'm hoping that you said the same response and the same kind of rhetoric. But nevertheless, please, that's your opportunity to turn out. After those hearings are done, and again, I mentioned March, The Army will go back, it has their written comments, it's put those in a spreadsheet, it's got its economics in a spreadsheet, it's got strategic requirements in a spreadsheet, it has political power in a spreadsheet, and then it's going to put in your comments in a spreadsheet. And again, the dichotomy between your testimony and the testimony from the other 18 states is going to be night and day. And that's going to really hit them in the side of the face and say, and they look for low-hanging fruit. They don't want to have to get into big fights that drag out over years, okay? And this is a good time to mention it, is the reason that I want the community to be strong on this issue and convince our key congressmen and senators to embrace this issue is, first of all, they don't have the political clout. Second of all, they don't have the will of the people, the majority that is. They have a small minority, including the Chamber of Commerce. But instead of fighting this issue and delaying it and losing anyways, which is very likely, embrace this opportunity and go to the administration and President Obama, particularly while he's still in office, and explain why it's good for the United States, why it's good for U.S. Army, the people of Hawaii, and ask for a $5 to $10 billion package over a certain period of years, in addition to all these assets we're going to get, but to help us as a financial assistance transition package. And politic for that. Don't waste time politicking for don't go, don't go. So we're communicating that to some of your legislators, and we can talk more about what their responses are on that. Nevertheless, so I talked about all this stuff will go in the spreadsheets. So sometime around summer of 2015, there'll be congressional hearings. And the Army will have its input, Department of Defense will have its input. The Army will explain to them what the community's factor is, but the congressmen and senators are going to explain what their constituents and their own internal agendas are for maintaining or letting go of these military forces. And they will prescribe to the military which locations are hands-off, which ones are available, and which ones they want a compromise deal on, okay? I can't predict what's going to happen. It's going to be messy, but it's going to be quick. You know, I've been told by one anti-sovereignty critic that I'm being a used car salesman on this issue, and I'm trying to force decisions right away on this and telling you, don't think about it. We got to act now, and we got to make things happen. I'm not doing that because I'm a used car salesman and trying to sell you an old beat-up clunker. I'm telling you there is no time in this, because this is going to happen very quickly. This time, as you can see, this time frame has already left some of you behind, okay? And it's not going to wait. So this time next year, we're either going to be winners, losers, and there's nothing in between. And I'll tell you why I don't believe there's a compromise deal is not a good deal for us. There's either all are cut or we lose. So next time this year, I expect an announcement, and our last opportunity to input is officially the listening sessions, but all during this time, you know who your congressmen are, you know who your senators are. They got to be bombarded with opinions and your perspective and your desires. And we can talk about that more later too. But nevertheless, here's my biggest concern. Our congressmen take a naive, short-term approach and go to the Congress and negotiate with their colleagues and fight to get a compromise deal. And then come back to Hawaii and say, hey, voters, you know, pat me on the back. I did you good. We didn't lose 19,800. We only lost 10,000. Aren't I a great person for you? And at that point in time, you can say, you're a loser. You just let us down, because if any residual quantity of 8,000 or 10,000 left behind on Oahu as part of some compromise deal means no facilities will be turned over. It's just like the announcement they made a year ago where they're cutting 8,000. That meant nothing to me. That meant they finally figured out that the Stryker Brigade is no longer relevant here and it's easy pickings. But it still leaves enough people behind that they can station soldiers in all their bases, continue to need to do live fire, and retain the bases without doing any environmental cleanup, et cetera, et cetera. So no long-term benefits for the people of Hawaii, and this patting ourselves on the back when we come back and say we had a good deal is unforgivable. Now, I'm trying to portray, for instance, that let's take Tulsi Gabbard, for instance, who is against this idea, okay? She has aligned herself that she is pro-military and all the military needs to say. Okay, and that's okay if she says that publicly, but behind closed doors, if she was smart and wants to think the long term for Hawaii and her career as a politician to maybe be a future senator in a way, that she could use this opportunity as a negotiation with other senators and congressmen that she has to make relationships with, long-term relationships, to be a viable leader in our Congress, and say, hypothetically, and say, we support, we can take the cuts in Hawaii. Of course, I'm not going to say that publicly, but let's go ahead and cut in Hawaii, but when it comes time for you to have my back, whether it's the Marines, the Navy, and the Air Force, et cetera, no cuts, or if you come out for research programs of DOD with the university or other agencies in Hawaii, no cuts. I've got your back, Seattle, Tacoma, on this, but I want some quid pro quo later, in my career. That's an opportunity for a real statesman to use this opportunity to their political advantage. But if they go for the short-term win, I hope it comes back to backfire on them. Anyways, having said that, I'm going to leave this one up because it's key. I hope they're not so naive to fall into this pitfall. So having said that, that's my formal presentation, and I'm going to ask Manu to coordinate, talk about the frequently asked questions that I get all the time, and we'll talk about those and then open it up to your personal questions. If you need a form to fill out the written thing, a question to give to Manu, raise your hand and we'll get you something. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Al. Okay, so I have a list of frequently asked questions, so we're calling them facts. Number one, the transition of Barbers Point from the Navy to the state of Hawaii was poorly executed. Not many valuable resources were acquired, and the lands and facilities were vandalized, robbed, and damaged. What is to prevent a similar debacle if Schofield and Wheeler are turned over to the state? And our answer is going to be Rodlin Brown, a longtime community activist and volunteer in the Waianae community. She'll attempt to answer this question. Ms. Brown witnessed firsthand and participated in the closure and turnover of Fort Ord in California to California and the people of the Monterey community.
I came to Waianae in 1948 to surf. Duke Kahanamoku brought me. He brought me to the best place in the world to surf. I have been here off and on ever since. I came home to live permanently 15 years ago. My husband and I are part of and parcel of this community. In 1991, Fort Ord, California, was the home of the 7th Infantry. In 1982, and for 50 years prior to that, it had been one of the basic training camps of the Army. When it changed into the home of the 7th, it really impacted the housing situation on all of the Monterey Peninsula and all of the communities surrounding it. Rents went from $400 a month to $1,200 a month for the same place. It was devastating. 1991, the military finally announced that Fort Ord would be one part of the closure. And I was part of the community commission to formally close Fort Ord and formally figure out what we were going to do with Fort Ord and what we were going to demand of the military to be done to Fort Ord. We had the same problems on the Monterey Peninsula. Number one industry, tourism. Number two industry, military. So the small towns that surrounded Fort Ord were doing the same that everybody else thinks that Wahiawa should be doing, and that was, how are we going to survive? Well, if you go back to the Monterey Peninsula today, you will find that there is a town called Marina, another one Sand City, another one Seaside, and each of them will tell you they have never been better off than they are today, because they have permanent 20-year residents that live in their communities now. They have people that constantly shop in their stores, that patronize their restaurants, that go to the automobile dealerships. It's not a 2-year resident. It's a 20-year resident. Those towns have never, ever been better off than they are today. We asked a lot of the military. We demanded a lot of the military. One of the most beautiful locations on the entire base was the live fire range that overlooked the Pacific Ocean. The sand dunes all along the coast were a live fire range. Had been for 70 years. Well, there is a piece of equipment out there that comes in, takes up all of the land, fires off any munitions that are still live, gathers all the trash ammunition, and replaces the soil clean and serene. That land is today a national park that people picnic in, they hike, they bike, they sail surf. It is the most beautiful, pristine location you can imagine. And for 70 years, it was live fire range. But it's safe. It's not Ko'olave. It's not, but we can do to Makua what was done to Fort Ord. And we all have to remember, it does not have to be left like Ko'olave was. Makua can be left as the live fire range at Fort Ord was left. And you can walk and I take my grandchildren on picnics there when I'm back in the mainland. Could never have done that before 1993 when they brought in this big piece of equipment. There is now University of California at Monterey Bay, at Fort Ord. They're big shopping centers. The homes were sold to the people of the surrounding communities, and they all became affordable housing. The number of the communities around Fort Ord are strictly for the wealthy. They are the Lani Kai of the peninsula, Pebble Beach, Carmel, Pacific Grove, Monterey. The housing there is 500,000 to 25 million. But the housing in the surrounding communities and the housing on the base itself belong to the people that can afford it, that work in the hospitality industry, that make $15 an hour or less, and they are all supporting the surrounding communities. Wahiawa has to think about the fact that when the troops deploy, they cry. So if the troops deploy again, Wahiawa merchants will be crying again. But if the homes of Schofield and Wheeler are priced that it can be affordable housing, we don't need to build Ho'opili. We can have the Eva Plain, and we can have ag land. So there are many, many good things that we can all say we want the government to do when they close these bases. We can make them whatever we want. And it won't be another Barbers Point. We had one man in particular who was a House of Representatives. His name is Leon Panetta. Leon, to this very day, is still very involved with the continuation of rebuilding the land that Fort Ord was. And all that land became part of other cities. Became part of Marina, became part of Seaside, became part of Sand City. So it is all now tax revenue property for those towns. Those people pay taxes to those towns. Military doesn't pay taxes to anybody. There are so many reasons. And when you are interested, I'll be happy to go into it even deeper. But it is a strong recommendation on my part. We did it in 4 years, 1991, and it was completed in 1995. And it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful.
Mahalo. Our frequently asked question number 2, when the bases are turned over from the federal government to the state of Hawaii, what are the conditions for the transfer? Will these bases be turned over as is, or will environmental cleanup occur of training and industrial areas to eliminate hazardous and dangerous sites? How can we trust the military to do what is pono to restore our precious aina? And to answer this question is Lieutenant Colonel retired Joe S. Torres. He'll attempt to answer this question. Uncle Joe is a native of Hawaii, one of 20 children from the same mother. He's a pilot in the Army and has worked for the federal government for 55 years. In Europe, he served with the Army Corps of Engineers and coordinated the transfer of 275 facilities from the U.S. Army to the government of Germany.
Hello, my kako. I was privileged to be a member of the United States Army, served 20 years. And those years, I went from a private to a lieutenant colonel. I received my political science degree from University of Nebraska. The Army paid for it. I got my master's in international relations from University of Arkansas. The Army paid for it. So there's a lot of benefits to be a part of the United States Army. I come home after spending 35 years with the Department of Defense. Come home to Hawaii, I took my American flag off my shoulder. I took the American heart that I raised my hand to defend this country. I took that American heart out and I put the Hawaiian heart in here. And in that process, I realized that there was something wrong with Kaho Olave, the way it was returned back to the people. And then later I hear about Barbers Point. Well, I happened to be in Germany at the time when the Army decided to close down over 270 installations, just like Schofield, Wheeler, and so on. I was with the Corps of Engineers at that time. I was Chief of Engineers Operations for the district in Europe, equivalent to the Honolulu district. I was the Chief of Operations. In that position, the Corps of Engineers was responsible for cleaning up, preparing every installation to give back to the Germans. One example I'll tell you about. The Corps of Engineers built a brand new hospital, similar to what is at Queens West. Is that Queens West? Okay. Brand new at this military air base in Ryan Mine. When it was completed, we never used it. It was on an air base. Took the keys and handed it over to the German. So that tells you that we can give back things that we build, and we will do graciously what we're asked as military or as Americans. I was part of an inspection crew that went out to some of these firing ranges and installations. And the inspection crew had American Corps of Engineers, environmentalists, civil engineer, biologists, geologists, and so on. We inspected, and we had to write the report that it's all clear. And then we sat with the Germans, and they had their equivalent team on the other side of the table. So we were signing all these papers and said, here, you can have Kaneohe Marine Base back. The Germans looked at us and said, we inspected it after you inspected it, and we found this whole list of things that you missed. Go back and clean it, and when we are satisfied that you have met our conditions, our standards of cleanliness or removal of hazardous material and so on. An example was this big berm that was used as a firing target holding. The berm was just full of bullets, lead bullets, copper, and so on. They went in there and they found one bullet. The Corps of Engineers had to have 40 vehicles come back and take all that soil, and they said, you sanitize it, you clean it, and bring it back again. How much did that cost? We were doing that because the Germans decided they're going to take it back on their condition. Okay? So the lesson here, folks, is that we need to prepare now for the time if and when the installations are returned back. Because who's going to be on the other side of the table with the United States Army on this side? you are, or your representative in the government. The key here is that the Corps of Engineers representing the United States government was not returning the property back to the community or to a Hawaiian Civic Club or to whatever. It was returning the property back from this government to that government, equal. So we need to make sure that our government is prepared to receive it different than the way they received back Kaho'olawe and Barbers Point and Waianae and others. Because Waianae is just another example of them not cleaning it. Why should we have to inherit that cleaning process? The Germans said, you go clean it back, you take it back, and oh, by the way, you use my construction equipment, my people. You know, you don't bring the people from the United States to clean it up. You use my people. So there are many ways for us to approach this. And like Rodlin just talked about, I've been back to the post where I was stationed at in 1960. 15 years after World War II stopped. I was there. And I went back to the post and looked at it just about a year ago. And like Rodlin's saying, the community is back and very vibrant. But when they were facing the closure of their military installation, the whole community was up in arms. They didn't want the Americans to go home. They wanted them to stay. For the same reasons. Oh, I'm going to lose my customers in my restaurant, and so on and so on. Same reasons. But there is historical precedence where every place that the United States military has left, they will do it in the way that the people want it if the people ask for it. Okay? So as long as I am here because I am experiencing this, I'll be on that side of the table with all of you. And I will not allow the emotions of our heart to overcome our decision-making process, and we will receive it the right way when it's cleaned. And as I'll put it one more dimension on it, you put it back the way you took it. If there were trees in there, you go plant the trees. Because I look at Makua, I remember flying in Makua, and there was full of trees in that valley. And now I go there on the access, it's bare. It's bare like a desert. So part of my standard that I'm writing right now for us to receive Makua back is how many thousands of trees were blown down by the bombs or the weapon systems, you put them back in there. That's the condition we have to demand it, like Rodlin said, and it'll be done. And it's not going to be given back to the people who lived in Makua or to the Waianae community. It's back to the equal. If it has to be the kingdom, I'm not too sure it's a good idea to give it back to the state of Hawaii. They're not a government as equal as the United States. Okay? So think about these points that I bring out tonight. Thank you very much.
Okay, frequently asked question number 3. The Chamber of Commerce and Wahiawa businesses are very concerned about losing any military personnel and the local spending that they provide. What are the economic advantages and disadvantages associated with the 19,800 personnel recommended for downsizing on Oahu? I've kind of heard some of the answer to that question, but I think it can get a little bit deeper. So Al, you're going to be answering that one, please.
Thank you, Manu. I am not an economist, okay? But any more than you guys in the audience. Maybe there's a trained economist out there that I don't know about. But nevertheless, you all are, in your own rights, an economist. You have a budget, you have to make bills, you have to earn monies, you have to make the ends meet. So you are, in my opinion, are as much economists as someone coming in here and spouting off that they have the credentials. And in fact, if we have, which we are trying to find an economist to be on our team, but even if we do and they agree with our position, you know, it's going to be an economist fight. The Chamber of Commerce is going to say their economist is better than our economists, et cetera, et cetera. Nevertheless, but just for today and tomorrow too, you are an economist, and I want you to consider these numbers. And you think of the balance sheet of how much is the Army important to us economically or unimportant to us economically. Let me give you some numbers. For instance, the Chamber of Commerce says that the military service is a value of about $14.7 billion per year. $14.7 billion, that's for the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and a lot of money that comes to the state via DoD research monies. The Army piece is only $1.3 billion, okay, and that sounds like a lot, but according to the SPIA, the environmental assessment, only 16% of that 1.3 billion gets into the community and is used to pay general excise tax. So that's only $208 million. And that is small potatoes in my opinion, but again, don't let me form your opinion. But about $208 million per year may trickle out of soldiers' hands and get into local businesses in the Oahu economy. Balance that with this. Virtually no state taxes are paid by soldiers that are stationed here. And the reason why is because they come from their home of residence, many states of which, or that they wind up residents of which, have no income taxes. So it's to their advantage to be residents of other states that they don't have to share their wealth with. But I don't know what the number is, but it's above 95% that do not pay for state taxes. Any of the on-post personnel, 38,000 family members and soldiers, do not pay property taxes. Okay, the monies that they do spend for things and necessities and for nice-to-have items, TVs, etc., or food, and they spend on the commissary and the PXs. None of that money comes to the community. A little bit of it gets plowed back into their installations, but if it's spent on installation, it stays on installation. It does help with employment. There are non-appropriated employees there, many of which, though, are family members, okay, because there's a family member preference. Okay, so let's think of some other things. All of those facilities shown here, no rent is paid. No revenue comes to the state of Hawaii for the privilege of the use of those facilities. Imagine the rent that would be charged to us as, residents if we occupied any portion of those facilities. The Department of Defense brags about how much money is donated to the state of Hawaii Department of Education to assist with DoD students attending schools. Now, there's 4 schools on Fort Shafter, 4 schools on Schofield and Wheeler, but no high schools. But nevertheless, the DoD will brag that they donate a certain amount of money, which they call impact aid. But there's some arguments on how much that money is. Let's just go with the number that I trust the most, of $5,500 per student per year. I know. And I've heard 15,060. Okay, 1,500, 1,560. Whichever figure you use, compare that to what does it cost to educate a student in the Department of Education. About 12 to 15,000, depending on whose numbers you hear. So for every DoD student, every soldier whose student is going to school, it costs the Department of Education $132 million a year to educate, out of pocket. Okay, think about the state and county government services that are used by the soldiers and their family members, but no reimbursement. Think about the satellite city hall at Waianae, all those services that are provided, you know, whether it's a driver's license or car registration, etc. They get those services for free. If 49,000 and some odd family members and service members depart Oahu, that's 5.1% of our population. Imagine 5.1% of our population no longer using our roads, our beaches, our recreation areas, our schools, etc. Imagine the environmental damages and costs that we incur every time the military operates on Oahu. Imagine the cultural damages and expenses that occur. Imagine, well, I mentioned preferential hiring practices, but imagine the value of having Kolikoli Pass as a secondary access road for our use. If we were to put up a similar type access route over a lower pass that has been talked about in the past, the cost of that is $1 billion. So imagine, just right off the top, saving $1 billion by acquiring Kolikoli Pass. And then, and the most important of the costs, billions and billions of dollars of resources not available for our access or use. So those are just a few of things that I've thought about over the last couple months and others have thought about, and I know there's more, but you check the balance sheet. And remember that the Army is the smallest piece. They're the largest force, but they're the smallest piece economically, only 1.3 billion of the over 14.7 billion. But the Chamber of Commerce will not tell you that, and they advocate strongly that no forces should depart the island of Oahu or the state of Hawaii. Okay, so that's the best I can answer that, and I'll let you economists in the audience decide for yourself.
Okay, another frequently asked question. The Army has been present on Oahu since the illegal overthrow. Is the Army key to Hawaii and the Pacific's defense security? Is the Army key to President Obama's renewed focus on the Asia-Pacific area? So that goes back to Al again.
This is an easy one. The Army is located, isolated in central Oahu, away from strategic sea lift and away from strategic airlift. As opposed to, let's say, the Stryker brigades or combat team in Seattle-Tacoma, which is co-located with Fort Lewis, with McChord Air Force Base and stationed C-17 cargo aircraft, co-located with the Port of Seattle-Tacoma with cargo vessels readily available for contracting, and rail, if they need to go to the East Coast, very easily to rail across the United States to the other side and deploy. Compare that with Oahu, where we're not co-located with lift assets, we're not co-located with rail, and the myth that the Army is strategically located in the Pacific at the tip of the spear has not been a true myth since World War II. It has been a folk's tale in order to justify assets to be located here and bring pork and money here, but we have a Stryker brigade here which is unable to train, unable to deploy, and imagine, now just, the Stryker brigade was designed to deploy within 96 hours to harm's way, okay? That was General Shinseki's desire. In order to make the Army relevant from its legacy forces of conventional World War II forces, we need these light mobile forces to deploy within 96 hours. Well, that is a technical impossibility. So, but it justified, and it helped Senator Inouye justify bringing that pork to Hawaii. To deploy the Stryker Brigade out of Hawaii, out Oahu, for instance, takes 254 aircraft flights just for the equipment. Okay, that doesn't even include logistics and personnel. So, Matt, can you imagine how long it takes to get the Air Force's assets in the theater and be able to deploy them from Oahu to God knows where at the quantity of 254 aircraft? And the Air Force can at any one time, if they surge, can only free up 36% of its aircraft at any one time to move one Stryker Brigade. And again, it takes that many flights to move them. So it's a logistics nightmare that isn't talked about, but it's totally accepted. You know, when you actually deploy a force, as you may recall, when we deployed forces to Iraq, how long did it take before we started deployment, before soldiers could fight across the line of departure and actually engage the enemy? It was over 1 year. Okay, it takes that long. It is just the dynamics and the physics of deploying to a foreign area. Now complicate that with the standpoint that the Army has to occupy a benign, safe environment. Okay, so if there's a hot spot in the Pacific, it can't go into that hot spot. It has to go somewhere in a safe harbor or a safe airport, unload, prepare for combat, acquire all its logistics, and then maneuver to the fight. Again, that takes months and months of preparation. You know, they can paint any picture they want on it, but the facts are it takes time. So guess what? If it's going to take that much time anyways, you can do it quicker from the West Coast than you can from Oahu, because we just don't have the assets. Could you imagine 36% of the Air Force lift assets falling in on Hickam Air Force Base at any one time and shutting down commercial flights, et cetera, et cetera? Almost impossible. So that's a myth. It's a myth that the Army's on the tip of the spear. It's a myth that it's important to the strategic value in the Pacific. And let's talk about President Obama's desire to have presence and expand United States' role in the Pacific. There's different areas of national power. Military power is only one element of the president's power. But what's more appropriate element of power to use in the Pacific Rim? Economics, diplomatic, informational. Okay, those sell well, those achieve results in the Asian environment. Military engagement does not achieve results in the Asian environment. So it's like trying to plug a round peg in a square hole. That's, so when you hear about the president's engagement plans in the Pacific, think of diplomatic and economic. We no longer fight amongst countries militarily. We compete economically, and we have economic relationships. The Cold War days and the conventional warfare days of the past are over. Anything to the contrary is usually hype or some aspect of the industrial military complex trying to portray a situation that can benefit a special agenda or special purpose. I could go into that forever, but let me just halt there. Okay, thanks.
Okay, don't go far, because you're the answer for the next question also. One anti-sovereignty representative recently called you a treasonous and the most dangerous candidate for the 2015 legislature. Congratulations. As a retired Army colonel, are you being disloyal to the Army by advocating for the downsizing of Army forces on Oahu?
I get that a lot. That, you know, that the question is you were in the Army. Why are you against the Army being on Oahu? That doesn't follow my common sense or logic trail. But in fact, I am pro-Army, and I have to change my loyalties to the Army. I just happen to have some information that I believe that would help enhance the Army's ability. I also am not anti-Marine, Navy, Air Force, or any of the services. And as I told you earlier, I think I told you earlier, that I am the sovereignty movement's the lesser of two evils. I am the lesser of two evils, okay? Because I'm still pro-military, but at least in the aspect of the United States Army being on Oahu, I can be taken advantage of, and I have no problem being taken advantage of, because it's right for the United States taxpayer, it's right for the U.S. Army, it's right for all of us in Hawaii that the U.S. Army not be here, because they can't, they're isolated, they're irrelevant, they're not combat ready, they can't train here, and they can't deploy from here. So let's be honest and put them in a location where they belong. They have to cut anyways, so cut where it's the most expensive place in the country to be stationed. There is some belief that being stationed in Hawaii is an enlistment incentive. Okay, that is commonly held, that it can be an enlistment enticement. But frankly, with these kind of cuts, enlistments aren't going to be an issue. Okay, in fact, they're going to have to increase standards to where probably no one under a high school degree can come into the service, and no waivers allowed. But when you talk about re-enlistment incentives, Hawaii is horrible for that, because soldiers don't like it here. For whatever reason, families and soldiers don't like it here, and they would rather be in other installations. So they often re-enlist to get out of here. So the Army, and if the Army had its way, it wants to be somewhere where it can deploy from, somewhere where it can train from, and somewhere where it can afford to operate and live. It doesn't like having to pay a fortune to have people off post. Oh, by the way, for the 10,000 people, go back to the economic piece, and what the Army pays, and out of their own pocket, you know, they just don't give money to just throw away willy-nilly. I mean, every dollar they spend on personnel is a dollar they can't spend on a weapon system or combat readiness or a repair part. But for the 10,000 soldiers that live off base, even though they build all this housing, the average E5, let's say a sergeant, young sergeant with a wife, gets an extra $3,200 a month to pay for rent or buy a house. As a lieutenant colonel, as a colonel, I looked at the new charts. I get $4,200 extra. I don't now because I'm retired, but if I was active duty, I'd get $4,200 to pay for my house that I would buy or rent. What do you think that does to the price of rentals and the price of housing in Oahu? Imagine that disappearing. And there's going to be some realty people and some investors that are going to not be unhappy. But, you know, the real affordable housing is access to this housing that exists, and then taking away of all this artificial inflated allowances that drives up prices. The impact on the economics and affordable housing is huge, almost threefold. But nevertheless, but right now the Army pays a fortune in having themselves stationed here. And then, you know, the argument isn't, should the Army downsize? I'm not going to argue that. The argument, as this poster says, it's not about should the Army downsize. If you want to argue that, and national defense and the Army should be big, or the military should be big and strong, and et cetera, go argue that with someone else, because those arguments, those discussions do occur. We're here only to discuss where the downsizing should occur, okay? So So in that respect, or in the respect of having to put a force in the most expensive place in the United States, what that does is it puts a combat ineffective, hollow force on the island of Oahu that on paper looks like it is something, but in reality it is untrained, it is not equipped, it doesn't get the repair parts it needs, it's not getting the logistics it needs, and it's combat ineffective. We need combat effective forces on the mainland, in other locations that make strategic sense. So I'm not anti-Army, I'm not a treasonist. Oh, by the way, just for those that have never looked at what a treasonist is, and this is offensive to me, not because that's what he called me, but a treasonist is someone who gives aid and comfort to the enemy. And when I looked at the definition of that specifically, I'm thinking, my God, the Hawaiian people are the enemy? Not my enemy, not the United States government's enemy. I mean, the defense intelligence agencies and other intelligence agencies have different warning and indicators that they use to determine who is the enemy of the United States. And it isn't the Hawaiian people, not at this point anyways. And when it may ever get that way, then I'll reassess my position. But I find it offensive that this person would call the Hawaiian people an enemy, and that my effort to assist the state of Hawaii and the people of Hawaii to be viewed as aid and comfort to the enemy, I find offensive. So having said that, I take the moniker of being the biggest threat to the legislature for 2015 as a badge of honor from this guy.
Okay, this question comes from the audience, and so I guess it could be open to whomever would like to answer it. How do you explain to a breadwinner who works for the U.S. Army base that he no longer has a job? How would he pay his rent, his lease, his mortgage, his bills that support his family? Lopaka, you have an answer?
I would like to start to learn our real history. It has nothing to do with the U.S. We need to use our terms correctly. It's not the mainland, it's the continent. And as proud as you are working for the Army, your issue should be with the continent. Not here. This is not about American.
I agree. Did I make that mistake? That blurred. If I said mainland, that blurted out by accident. Sorry.
Okay,
but
mahalo.
On that question, that is a tough one for that individual.
Right.
Who is employed and receiving benefits. It is tough. There are going to be up to 6,000 associated employees that support, according to the EA, 3,000 direct employees and 3,000 indirect employees that support the military at Schofield and Wheeler. On the surface, it looks like they will immediately lose their jobs. Let's take, for instance, the housing here is on a contract, a long-term lease, 50-year lease actually. So there are contractors, there's a contract and workers associated with for 50 years. And people think, well, there's a 50-year lease, they can't downsize. Well, virtually all of the housing in the Army nationwide is on a long-term lease like this. It was, outsourced. Those leases are easily to be broken. 50-year means nothing to the government. If you don't think there's a back-out clause in there, then you're dreaming. Will the government have to pay out of their hide to get out of that? I think they'll have to pay some kind of penalty. But nevertheless, let's take the people associated with that contract. All right. Now, if the state of Hawaii did the transition properly, and let's say that that same collection of housing, hypothetically, was turned over to a community of people, there's no reason why they can't continue to be maintained by a similar contractor. They have to be maintained somehow as an association. So why can't a similar contractor or then a similar type of employees wind up taking care of the same requirement. There's going to be stores pop up. There's going to be all kinds of facilities pop up to support permanent facilities located on these bases, all that require jobs. And then there's the jobs of environmental cleanup that will take 10 to 40 years, depending on how much money and how fast we want to move along. Think of all the jobs, of all those things that Uncle Joe talked about that we had to do in Germany to remediate and correct problems, and so we could turn over some facilities. Imagine how many jobs that will bring in. And hopefully Hawaii jobs, and not all these contractors coming from the mainland that come in for rail right now, come in and run PVT and other things that we should be doing. But do I have any
It's the surrounding towns and the towns that will be created, as happened at Fort Ord. There will be industry, a whole new life will come to be when there is not military there, but there is a different kind of industry that is created by the people that live in, around, and near. Say the film industry. All kinds of other things can take place on this land that are not there right now, but they will be because the jobs will be created.
But for Manu, for that one specific question, and for that constituent who has potential to lose their job, there is going to be some emotional trauma that we can't avoid.
Absolutely.
Okay, mahalo. The next question came from the audience also. If the federal deficit and the national debt gets real bad, wouldn't there be more cuts in the military within the 10 years? So I guess this is a hypothetical question. Do you see this happening?
Well, this is outside my kuleana, but the budget is set for the military through this time frame. It gets locked in at certain years, just like the state budgets do, but the federal government budget and what's programmed and fenced for the Department of Defense goes out normally 9 years. And it's adjusted every year since, so nothing's a guarantee. But for purposes of planning, and in the short term, the federal government will continue to print money at whatever rate it needs to print money to meet its obligations. And that's, but you're getting into an area that's very gray. But I would just focus right now that in front of us is the opportunity to have the requirement for 130,000 soldiers to be cut, 19,800 of which for the island of Oahu, and potentially more.
Okay, this is a number of parts to this question, so I'll start with the beginning. What is Schofield and Fort Chapter's personnel size, active, family, DOD, civilians, etc., and is, considering that, the 16,000 and the 3,800 significant enough for base closure size reduction consideration?
Okay, you may not be able to see this, but we're going to just talk soldiers and civilians right now. Okay, Fort Chapter's at 7,431. Lose 3,800. We're down to 2,725. Schofield Barracks, 18,441 minus 16,000 gets us down to 2,441. And what I'm saying that this residual amount that's left over, 2,441 soldiers, would easily fit and be consolidated on Shafter. So with the cuts proposed now, the Army needs to consolidate all its personnel at Fort Shafter, and that's what frees up the facilities on Schofield and Wheeler. Now, the other number you may be interested in is 49,500 and something, plus or minus some, I don't have a recall memory, is the total effective military members and family members. That's at 5.1% of Oahu's current population that could that will theoretically disappear off the island. Okay? Very few will stay on Oahu. Most of them will be, all of them will be reassigned or let go from service, and they will just return back to their home station. The numbers that I'm quoting are readily available in the Army's Programmatic Supplemental Environmental Assessment. You can find the links to that at oc4ad.com, all those numbers, and a whole host more. There's no secrets, although I think in the number of housing that the Army admits to on base, I think their numbers are old numbers, and there's more that they're alleging. But that's something I haven't had a chance to verify yet. But virtually all the numbers are accurate and available for you to review.
So from your expertise, you're saying that the counts are substantial, because the next question was, if the counts are not substantial enough for base closure, is it too premature to envision base closure and receipt of its assets?
Well, this is a good question for one reason primarily. We want to focus on the cuts. We want to support the cuts. Let's not get into divvying out the spoils of war and deciding how we're going to use these facilities, or more importantly, getting in arguments over DHL should get this, OHA should get this, or Hawaii should, the government of Hawaii should get this, or I should get this. Let's not get into those fights now of how this would be divvied up and how it would be managed, etc. Those decisions can be decided once the cuts are announced. Because once the cuts are announced, there's not even a BRAC process yet, base realignment and closure. That's a congressional action that has to be approved. And what we would say is we want, as soon as the Army announces, we want our congressmen and senators to demand an immediate BRAC for the state of Hawaii, not link us in other BRACs, but a specific BRAC just for us, so we can accelerate the process. If the substantial number of 19,800 is, as the Army recommends, is not cut, if a portion of that remains behind, as I said earlier, the compromise deal, then we have the opportunity for naive, young freshman congressional representatives to pat themselves on the back and say they won, but we lose, because anything less than what's on the table right now would probably justify the Army retaining both bases.
Mahalo. Then the last part of these questions were an apology for not having read the draft FONSI, but wanted to know if you responded to the initial primary concerns or questions of the RPT first. I don't know if that was supposed to be PRT, request for proposal, RFP? Report of the report first.
Well, even though the FONSI comments were particular to the issues identified, both the categories of environmental concerns, and there was like 20 of them. She had a chance to respond to that. You could still respond to that, and they'd review it and file it. It wouldn't have much impact. What's going to have impact next is the hearings, but I'm not sure that I answered your question right, though.
I think the question was, have you responded to it? Correct?
Well, as in behalf of the Oahu Council for Army Downsizing, yes, I did a 4-page response, and it looks like so, and it's available online. And I think it paints a really good argument, because it discusses the strategic value. It discusses the economic costs. It discusses that there are environmental issues that the Army thinks are bad if the Army leaves. I don't see how, for instance, they say, for instance, that there is a minor but mitigable impact on the environment if the Army loses. No, I say it's a positive impact if the Army leaves, because it will get cleaned up. But I just ask you to take some time to look at my response, and it might help you form opinions for the hearings coming up. Yeah, please.
I have some questions for you. I know. Thank you, Jack. I can't hold a mic, a cane, and a paper at the same time. Let the cane go. Okay. What can you do to help? First of all, you should review online at www.oc4ad.com and sign the petition. Secondly, like you have done tonight, get involved. Get your neighbors involved. Get your community involved. Get your children, your grandchildren. Get people involved. This does not have to do with Waianae. This has to do with Oahu. It has to do with Hawaii. We need everyone involved. Contact your congressmen and your senators. Let them know how you feel. Let them know what you want them to do, because they work for you. They don't realize this sometimes, but that is what we say when we elect them, is we elect them to work for us. Contact them and let them know that we want them to work for us, that this is their job. Share with them your feelings. Contact the mayor, contact the governor. And contact the mayors of the other islands. This is a Hawaii problem. This is not a local problem. This is a problem for all of us. And we all have to get involved, and we must get elected officials involved. We must let them know how we feel. We must let our pastors know, and we must let our neighbors know. This is our responsibility. Attend and participate. That's the best thing you can do. When these meetings are called, please, like you did today, attend and participate. Right now, we're in the mode of, we need the Army to go home. We need them to leave. They are not a viable force on this island. The Marines are a viable force and they can deploy. The Navy is a viable force and it can deploy. The same thing with the Air Force. You can't have a viable force that it takes 1 year for them to become active in the job they're supposed to be doing. If we had another Okinawa, would it take our Army a year to be able to fight the battle? That's ridiculous. But we don't have 300 planes that could land on Okinawa. So where would they land them? I mean, the Army is not a viable force here. They are extremely viable out of the SeaTac, Seattle area. And that's where they should be deploying from. Stay involved and stay Akamai. You have no idea how much we appreciate all of you being here tonight. We hope you will continue to be part of this downsizing. We need each and every one of you to become a part of it. If you belong to an organization that would like to join in being part of the council that goes before anybody and everybody, please contact Al and let them know. There were 3 of us that showed up at Maisie Harona's office. It would be nice if there were 20 of us that showed up. But we do need each and every person to be part of this. Thank you for listening to me.
Your name again, are you Mrs. Frenzel or Mrs. Collins?
No, sir. My name is Rodlin Brown. I'm married to Ed Brown. There is no correction about it. That is who I am, and I am a resident of Waianae.
You belong in Monterey. You do a wonderful job of PR work there. That's where you're from.
I did a wonderful job of PR work here, too. Well,
All right.
we all have different opinions.
Excuse me, but let's get back to what we were talking about. We have one more question. Mahalo nui. We have one more question, and this was, why was this meeting not properly advertised? Why was the public not adequately notified? Why do we have no time to prepare? Will there be any more meetings? So you might want to answer that.
That last part of that question is great. The others, this was even advertised in the Star Advertiser. 2,300 mail-outs were done, and then handouts were done at all the community neighborhood board meetings. But nevertheless, and oh, by the way, please go to the website because you can see this presentation with Mililani Trask on First Friday. You can see it on was with Dr. Dudley and Polka and Leon Su. So it was been on TV about three different episodes, different shows. But the most important part is this is going to be done again. And we're going to export this same product to other communities like the north side and the south side. So my hope is to do at least 2 different presentations. This is more of, if this issue doesn't sell in the Leeward Coast, it's not going to sell anywhere because of, the constituents that are out here, the Hawaiian people in particular, that this should play well to. So now we can go into the other locations where it may not play so well, but we still need to export this communication to them as well, with the intent to prepare people and get them motivated to show up for the hearings.
Okay, so we're going to conclude the evening. I just need to make sure as a Kanaka Maoli and a national, Hawaiian national, that all the audience understands the difference of opinions and that we're sitting here and we're listening to what people say and how they feel. I think one of the ways you could get Hawaiian nationals to support the idea is that it is an increment of demilitarizing our aina and our kingdom. So that's why you're going to have a lot of Hawaiians, if you are lucky, in the audience supporting it. So that's always important to remember, that our audience is diverse. We're not just looking to get rid of the Army, but we are looking at a demilitarization because of the occupation of the Kingdom of Hawaii. And hopefully, because those of you who are foreigners here and not Hawaiian nationals, but you've chosen to take this on, we'll also be able to work together in the future. And that's what I see as an opportunity for all of us living in this Pai Aina who care about this Aina.
So I just wanted for us to leave with a good heart and good spirit. Dear Lord, we thank you, Lord, for this time. A lot was said, Lord. We pray for understanding, Lord. And Lord, let us go forth, not with our minds, Lord, but with our pu'uvai, our hearts. As you have brought the first people to this place, and you've guided them here, we ask that that same wisdom and that same guidance be with us today. as we leave and go home to our homes and family. Bless us as we travel, Lord. In Jesus, your precious name we pray. Amen.